Hi there, I'm Rosemary Barton. Here's what's been at issue this year.
This afternoon, I stepped down as leader of Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition.
The Emergencies Act is not something that's been used ever, but it exists for a reason.
Today, we woke up to a changed world. Russia has launched a brutal and unprovoked attack on Ukraine.
What we've been able to do is to use our power in this minority government to get help to people.
It clearly is not adequate support to continue on as leader.
Together, we have done the impossible. We have made history.
They don't need a government to run their lives. They need a government that can run a passport office.
I'm going to be the premier of all Quebecers.
Yeah. There are still some difficult days ahead for Canada's economy.
We will continue to do everything we can to stand against the Iranian regime.
We are finally telling the federal government, no more. It's time to stand up for Alberta.
What we're calling for today is just a meeting to sit down with the Prime Minister to have the discussion about a fair and sustainable funding for the future of healthcare in our country.
Just some of the political moments of 2022, one of those moments where you remember how much happened, and who better to look back at some of the highs, lows, and political first than with the At Issue panel. Chantal Hébert, Andrew Coyne, Althea Raj, and Elamine Abdul-Mahmoud. That's our producer, Ariel, who always manages to put the year together in 1 minute, and there's a lot that happened. So we're going to go through some key questions to all of you as quickly as we can. Andrew, first one to you. One word to describe the year in politics and why.
Unmoored, I guess I would say. This is a year in which a lot of things that we thought were settled or stable or set in stone for many years, if not decades, became kind of unhinged, untethered from their previous moorings. So inflation, for example, which would remain stable for 30 years before this, really made a breakout. Or we thought there was a peace in Europe that was going to last for a long time, that countries wouldn't be invading each other. We thought the stability of the democratic and constitutional order in the United States, and yes, even in Canada, we thought those were pretty much not going to be questioned. And all these things seem to be in play now. All these things seem to be things that we can't necessarily take for granted. And it's not at all clear that the political parties, the main ones, have connected themselves to that new fact and are really addressing this very changed world that we're in.
Elamine.
Reactive is my word. I would say that a lot of governments, not all the governments, but a lot of governments have spent most of the year reacting instead of being proactive, instead of sort of exerting their will, their political will on the world. I think starting the year with the signals that inflation was going to continue to get worse and worse, then the invasion in Ukraine, and then from there on, it's just been a lot of being reactive to the world instead of specifically trying to shape it.
Chantal.
Polarizing, and I'm not so sure that Canadians are as polarized as their political parties would want them to be. And I'll give you two examples. Vaccine mandates, which started off as a suggestion by a Liberal strategist that it was the way to a Liberal majority in an election, and led us to the convoy and to Pierre Poilievre using it as a springboard to a first ballot leadership victory. Which involved a leadership campaign, that didn't see a lot of policies being debated because it was all over about the wedge and polarizing, and more recently the Liberal moves on gun control, which in large part are an attempt to create new wedges. I'm not sure how Canadians react to the notion that their political leadership is inviting them into us versus them conversations at a time when probably a lot of Canadians need politicians to be talking to each other rather than pitting them against each other.
Althea.
I also had polarized for many of the same points that Chantal made. I feel like this year, instead of working together, we saw party leaders really try to score points by dividing Canadians and speaking to Canadians in certain groups. The Freedom Convoy is obviously a prime example, which flowed, as Chantal noted, into Pierre Poilievre's leadership. Also a gun control, but also I would lump in some of the things that Andrew talked about in terms of the use of the notwithstanding clause, which was deeply polarizing. Bill 96, which became law earlier this year, also deeply polarizing. So to me, that is really the word of 2022.
Elamine, what was the biggest political win of the year?
I think the biggest political win of the year was probably Justin Trudeau's testimony at the Emergency Act inquiry. That inquiry was going just fine for the Liberals. I don't think it was going great, but his sort of last day testimony did seem to pull it out of the political fire. I'm not sure that he made the legal case for the use of the act, but I think he sort of landed the political one, and I think a lot of people were surprised by that.
Chantal, biggest win.
I picked François Legault. He's the first Quebec Premier, Quebec incumbent, to win a second majority victory since René Lévesque. That's a hell of a long time ago.
Yeah.
But in the process, this party that he created, it's a very young party, has endured and survived successfully a first term, but also it has crushed and rendered almost irrelevant the two main parties that define Quebec, the Quebec Liberals and the Parti québécois. There are 3 Parti québécois members left in the National Assembly. So this second victory basically has obliterated the line that defined Quebec politics for decades until 2018. I think that's a big victory.
Big win, Andrew Coyne.
I would say Pierre Poilievre's win as the Conservative leader was sweeping and massive, a huge majority across the country in a way that left him being beholden to no section of the party, and rather similar to Chantal's point, kind of erased some of the existing divisions within the party, at least for now. This is the Pierre Poilievre party right now, absolutely and wholly.
Althea?
I said the Emergencies Act, not so much Mr. Trudeau's testimony, but the government's use of the Emergencies Act. It was a situation where it felt like our institutions were crumbling. The province, Ontario, decided, frankly, not to show up. And the federal Liberals turned a situation where they could have looked helpless to Canadians and to the international community, frankly, into a big win. And yes, that culminated in Mr. Trudeau's very successful 5-hour grilling at the inquiry. But, you know, the Liberals came out of that rather better than they went in. And that to me, is the big coup of the year.
Okay, Chantal, what was the biggest political surprise of the year?
And I'm going to go back to what others picked, which was, but for different reasons, the Prime Minister's performance at the Rouleau Commission. One, it showed something that is really interesting, that you can be the Prime Minister for, 6 or 7 years and still be underestimated, which is the best place to be in politics, frankly. And this is the kind of performance that should have made the Conservatives look up and say, this government will not necessarily defeat itself for us. We're going to have to raise our game. But it has also convinced a lot of Liberals that it is the right thing to do to have Mr. Trudeau lead them in a fourth campaign. A year ago, some people who probably should have known better were going on the record saying in 2022, Justin Trudeau will step down. Well, no one's talking about that now.
No, they're not. Andrew, biggest surprise?
I think the Ottawa occupation, it was certainly a surprise to the Ottawa authorities and the police. But
and to the people who lived here.
But more broadly, it had an enormous impact on the Canadian politics. It led directly to the decommissioning of Erin O'Toole, for example, and just it was an extraordinary thing that I don't think a week before anybody would really have predicted.
Althea?
Same thing. The Frida convoy's arrival, especially in Ottawa. Yes, it led to Erin O'Toole's removal, although I'm pretty sure that would have happened regardless. But it led to Pierre Poilievre's massive victory. It led to the removal of the city's first Black police chief. It has fundamentally shaped politics this year. It helped defeat Jason Kenney, that movement, that anti-vax movement. It helped Daniel Smith become the new premier of Alberta. It had, it's something that we could not have predicted this time last year.
And that had all that kind of fallout, you're right. Elamine, biggest surprise?
Listen, I hate to repeat it again, but also the convoy. But let me take it slightly in a different direction, which is to say that, we've had a public inquiry about the use of the Emergencies Act that was supposed to lead us into further understanding the convoy after that it's done. It's now done. Do you feel like you particularly understand what the convoy was better now? Because I certainly don't. I don't think that the inquiry shed enough light as to the things that we need to be thinking about. But the fact that this political element exists in this country, that it is politically powerful, at least politically powerful enough to steal the headlines and cause a lot of headaches, but we still don't really fully understand the political allegiances and the political interests of the convoy. I think like that is the biggest political surprise, and I would be surprised if not every single political party isn't thinking about that at least a little bit now.
Okay, next question. Who impressed you the most with their leadership? Chantal, you picked someone outside the bubble, kind of. Here he is.
If Russia further escalates, we will follow with more severe measures. Russia and its acolytes can spin and can contort all they want, but the violations of international law are theirs.
Okay, Chantal, why did you pick Ambassador Ray?
Because he is really delivering a different kind of Canadian diplomacy at the UN than what we've seen over the past few decades. You know, this sentence that has become ridiculous of Justin Trudeau and others when they came to power, Canada is back. It certainly has been back at the UN since Ray was appointed, and I think he has become a major influence on the crafting of Canadian foreign affairs policy, and I should say for the better.
Althea, who impressed you in terms of their leadership?
I did not say Bob Ray, but I just want to say to Chantal that's a very good point. And in fact, if Mr. Ray had been the ambassador, I wonder if we would have won a Security Council seat. I picked François-Philippe Champagne, who's the Innovation Minister, known around town here as like the Energizer Bunny. He's not someone who chases the headlines, although he loves it when we give them to him. But he's someone that is praised by the opposition as much as stakeholders, as much as his own bench, as somebody who actually gets stuff done. And a lot of the investments that we see in the auto sector is because of François-Philippe Champagne.
Elamine.
My answer for who impressed me most and who impressed me least is kind of the same, so I'm going to do this at the same time.
Oh, well, then I won't go back to you. Perfect. Go ahead.
All right. So Chrystia Freeland. Chrystia Freeland is the person who impressed me the most, and that is immediately after the invasion of Ukraine. I think her political leadership on the world stage was impressive, I think, in terms of marshaling our allies and just kind of uniting the international front on Russia and Ukraine. That was a deeply impressive political performance. But then we kind of get into the summer and her reaction to inflation in this country. And it was quite sluggish. It was not the kind of reaction that you'd expect from a government that has said it is seized with and really concerned about how people are doing, financially speaking. When they finally announced some kind of reaction to the increase in inflation, their reaction was to announce a bunch of repackaged promises that we already sort of knew about. And so I would say that she was very well suited to respond to the Russia-Ukraine crisis, and then very delayed response when it comes to the inflation crisis.
Andrew.
Well, I don't know if we're confined to Canadian politics or not, but if not, I don't think anybody on the planet can hold a candle to Volodymyr Zelensky's leadership that he's shown throughout the year. It's really quite remarkable. If we were to say somebody in Canada, I'd have to say it's a bit thin on the ground, but I might mention John Horgan in British Columbia, who, you know, after a relatively successful premiership, is that rare politician to have stepped down while he's still on top. I know his health would have had a lot to do with that, but even so, to go out with still, basically the public still very broadly in support of you is a real rarity in Canadian politics.
Yeah, we'll leave when you're on a high. Okay, when it comes to who impressed you the least, I think three of you agreed. Here is this person.
The notwithstanding clause is a constitutional tool for provincial governments to use. It's well within our government's right to use this tool.
Althea, did you pick Doug Ford? Yes?
I did, yes.
All right. Why?
I am just shocked and outraged in a way that I frankly haven't been in a very long time when it comes to politics. It wasn't about the notwithstanding clause, though I was disturbed about that the first time he floated the idea when he wanted to reduce the size of Toronto City Council. That was several years ago. And then on election advertising. And then this time he really miscalculated. But for me, the most egregious part of Mr. Ford's tenure since being reelected with a renewed majority government involves the Greenbelt. The fact that the Greenbelt, so public space, it's mostly agricultural land, was kind of wink, wink, nudge, nudge, sold to many conservative donors, people with close ties to the progressive conservatives, for multiples of millions of dollars, is like, you know, we talked so much about cash for access with regards to the federal Liberals years ago. This is an example of cash for access. Like, we don't have clear examples of alleged inappropriate behavior. I want to say another word, but I don't want to get sued. So I'm going to, you know, leave it to people's imagination to think what I really think about this. It is so outrageous and unethical that I cannot understand that we allow this to continue and that the government is not getting grilled about this more than they are. And it's not just that, it's the relationship with lobbyists, allegations of lobbyists being around the cabinet table. Like, it is just so unclean. Yeah. How is this allowed to happen in 2022?
Chantal, you also picked Doug Ford.
Yes, and people must be noticing because he has sunk back to the pre-pandemic levels of unpopularity. I have always thought that the pandemic was the best thing that happened to Premier Ford, but I also assumed that he had learned some things along the way. When it comes to the Greenbelt, for instance, he never campaigned on this, or when he did, he said the opposite of what he's doing today.
He broke his promise, yeah.
Yes. I'm reminded when I think back to BC politics, because Andrew raised John Horgan in BC, that the premier who promised to not have an harmonized sales tax and then went back on his word never recovered. And that is what happens to people who campaign on one thing and then do the reverse when they are in government. And I find that it's troubling to watch the way this government is going from crisis to crisis to crisis, and all of them self-created.
Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, there was a feeling in the air during the pandemic that, oh, you know, maybe Doug Ford has grown a bit in the office. He's not the Doug Ford of old. But then as soon as the constraint was removed, you know, Ford unhinged, Ford unleashed, you know, and we had in the space of 2 months, I think I'm right in saying this, the notwithstanding clause stumbling into this hornet's nest of taking away the right to strike from public sector unions, who then let him have it, both barrels, and you had to you know, humiliating climb down on that. The Greenbelt thing, which has been discussed fully, and then thirdly, this cockamamie strong mayors version 2, where the mayors of these selected cities will be allowed to pass laws with less than majority support as long as they're doing the province's bidding. It's just objectionable on about 16 different counts, including that, like the other things, was never promised during the campaign. So the Ford of old has returned with a vengeance.
I believe this will be a quite bumpy year, and at the end of it, there might be some bruises on this government.
So will 2023 be a bumpy year? Time to look ahead, make some predictions, which they all hate doing, but they're gonna do it. Gosh darn it, Chantal, Andrew, Althea, and Elamine. Okay, let's start with the political leader or MP to watch in 2023. Andrew, why don't you start us off?
I'll go with Danielle Smith, not necessarily in a good way, but if she wins the election coming in the spring, then it will be validation for all of her antics and all of the positions that she's taken, in which case she will be a force to reckon with in the Federation for good or ill, I think mostly for ill. Although if you're the federal Liberals, you're not necessarily that upset about having that as an antagonist, because it's somebody you can basically run against.
Chantal.
I'm going to pick Chrystia Freeland for 2 reasons. As the finance minister, the success of the government and those bruises that the Bloc Québécois leader, M. Blanchet, seems to be hoping for, I'm guessing. She's the one who has to keep them from coming to the government on what is probably the most important file. But I'm going to keep an eye on her for another reason. And the reason is that as it becomes clear that Justin Trudeau is going to stick around for another election that may or may not take place until 2025, is there a time when Chrystia Freeland thinks I could be going on to other challenges? And I've had my decade in politics, it was successful, but do I want to pick up a 4th-term government or a leader of the official opposition's job in 2 or 3 years' time? I believe she has other options.
Yeah. Elamine.
My pick is for Jagmeet Singh. Jagmeet Singh is coming up about a year. It's going to be, a couple of months will be a year since that agreement that he made with the Liberals. I think he's going to have to start seeing some meaningful results that are actually paying dividends for the NDP. Otherwise, why would they continue to be in this agreement? They've had a couple of tests that show that, maybe people are not associating these successes with the NDP. So what does that mean? What does that mean for the party? What does that mean for his willingness to continue this partnership if it's not actually going to pay political dividends come 2024, 2025, or will he move a little bit sooner than that? So Jagmeet Singh is my political leader to watch.
Althea?
Well, my answer is boring, but rather obvious. It's Justin Trudeau, because although he is giving every indication that he plans to stay and fight the next election and that he relishes the thought of going head-to-head with Pierre Poilievre, if he does decide to take his walk in the snow, or I guess walk in the sunshine, and keep his party in a good spot to win the next election, then he would probably have to decide to leave in 2023.
Okay, Chantal, what's the biggest political challenge in the year ahead?
Oh, it shouldn't be so hard, but to manage to have an adult conversation between first ministers about healthcare. And the fact that it is looking like the biggest political challenge kind of says something about the childish conversation that they've been having.
Andrew?
Healthcare, it's not going to go away. And I don't think that the political incentives line up for any of these people to really, grasp the nettle on this. So we're going to be stuck with this, unfortunately, I think, for years to come, because, as I say, as bad as things have gotten, maybe there's starting to be movement in public opinion, but it's not yet registered with the political class of the kinds of changes that are going to be necessary.
Elamine?
I would say inflation. There's no evidence really that shows us that this is going to go away anytime soon. It's something that's sticking around. If, in fact, this country is going to go into a recession that is forecast to be mild, a mild recession is not necessarily a government killer. Recessions generally can be. So that's something that I think I'm sure that the federal government is thinking about very intensely, but also the idea that we could be at least somewhere around the middle of next year in a mild recession will have massive consequences. So I think that's what I'll be watching for.
Althea?
I feel like there's so many, it's hard to pick one, because I agree with the recession and inflation and healthcare, but to me, I think the state of the federation. It is incredibly concerning to see provinces bring forward bills that breach the rule of law, chip at the foundations of our federation, provinces amending the Constitution on their own. You can't do that. That, to me, is incredibly troubling. And, I don't know if Danielle Smith's going to win the next election in Alberta, but if she does, to Andrew's earlier point, that might be even more challenged. And what message does this send to other provinces, like Quebec, for example, who might feel emboldened in its own direction? So I think the state of the federation is definitely an upcoming challenge.
Chantal, which story in your mind didn't get the attention it deserved?
It's not so much a story, but it's kind of a pattern that I find increasingly intriguing, and that is the Liberal brand literally vanishing from the provincial scene in this country. Ontario, Quebec, where the Liberals are suddenly reduced to, I don't know, a field of ruins, former Premier Jacques Parizeau would describe it as. And at the same time, west of Ontario, there is not a Liberal party, including in BC, apparently. And at the same time, the federal NDP, and we talked about this earlier, seems to be going nowhere fast federally. But by the end of next year, it could be in government in 3 of the 4 provinces west of Ontario. And so I'm thinking, is there still room for 2 mainstream progressive voices at both levels of government? Or are we going into a universe where there will be one very dominant one, more so than we've known, and they will be different, New Democrats provincially and Liberals federally?
That sounds like a good column if you haven't written it yet. Althea?
I wondered what happened to the Build Back Better agenda. They galvanized so much ink during COVID. The lessons that we told ourselves we were certain not to forget and to work towards. The social safety net having huge gaps, what we were going to do about people who clearly cannot survive on welfare, the state of long-term care, health care, and no one's talking about that anymore. I mean, the government, yes, is moving forward with a disability benefit, but that disability predates even the COVID discussion. And so that, to me, is something that we, in a troubling way, I feel like we gave up on, that those lessons have not been learned, and we decided not to do anything about them.
And presumably it's not because everything has been solved, that's for sure.
No, clearly not.
No, Elamine.
I'm glad Althea brought that up, actually, because like we are coming up on some promises due about EI reform, and we haven't, like that's your backstop when you go into a recession. Like we do need the EI system to be quite robust. But actually my pick is China and this country's relationship to China, because our China policy has shifted in subtle and not so subtle ways in the last few months, and I think we haven't paid quite enough attention to that. There's been that story about maybe kicking out some of the Chinese ownership out of some Canadian mines. There's been that canceled RCMP contract. But on the whole, we seem to be finally kind of catching up to the idea that China poses a threat to us in this country, or at least we should be shifting our relationship to it in line with how a lot of other countries, including the United States, have been treating China for some time. I think that's a significant international shift, and I'm not sure we've had a chance to digest that enough.
Andrew.
Declining voter turnout. There's been some coverage of it, but I'm not sure people realize how bad it's got. We're now down to the low 60s federally. We used to be 75, 80% routinely in elections, but it's much worse at lower levels of government. In the recent Ontario election, it fell to 43%. That's the second lowest of any election, federal, provincial, in over 100 years. In the municipal election in Toronto, it fell to 29%. And in recent by-elections, we're routinely below 30%. So I worry that we're sort of getting out of the habit of voting. And I think that's something we really need to address.
Okay, thanks everyone. Merry Christmas, happy holidays.